Well, I have the unenviable task of introducing a man who needs no introduction, so I should only take about 20 minutes. Did you not say I had 20 minutes to introduce you?
You can take 30 if you need it. Yeah.
Okay. Jeremy Johnston, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is the managing editor of the papers of the William F. Cody project here at the Buffalo Bill Historical Centre. It is an excellent project, I would suggest, in which the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland is one of the partners. My colleague John Young, who's just spoken to you, is a senior lecturer in Scottish history there. Somebody gets to speak about me in a few minutes, so I won't say any more about me at this stage, but I'm also from the University of Strathclyde. And Jeremy has a very direct link to the University of Strathclyde because Jeremy is a PhD candidate at the University of Strathclyde as part of this partnership that we have established. Jeremy's background is as a Western historian. He taught history, mainly American Western history, in Northwest College in Powell for more years than he cares to remember. And he has been based here at Buffalo Bill Historical Centre for just under 2 years, heading up the Papers of William F. Cody project that was kicked off by his predecessor, the well-remembered Kurt Graham, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you. Just before I hand over to Jeremy, I just wanted to mention the key recent achievements of the project that Jeremy is heading up have been the publication of the first 2 volumes with the University of Nebraska Press of in the series, The Papers of William F. Cody. We have got a new critical edition of Buffalo Bill's autobiography and a critical edition of 4 Years in Europe with Buffalo Bill by Charles Elbridge Griffin, who travelled in Europe in the early part of the 20th century. And coming soon, we have the first critical edition of both Buffalo Bill From Prairie to Palace by John M. Burke, who was...
I'll hold this other one here. There we go.
By John M. Burke, who was Cody's publicity agent, and The Wild West in England, which was Cody's own follow-up volume to his autobiography. So those are coming soon. The 2 volumes here are upstairs in museum selections if anyone would like to acquire a copy. And these 2 volumes will be in museum selections in the next couple of months and can already be pre-ordered online. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Jeremy Johnston.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris, and my apologies to you, John, for placing you in the wrong department at Strathclyde. I should have known better. I'm a PhD candidate in your department, so not Chris's. Today I'm going to speak about Scots in Wyoming, following up on what John has just presented about the Scots as frontiersmen. I want to start with Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner presented his frontier theory before the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, then meeting in Chicago at the Columbian Exposition, where, as luck would have it, next door was Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Turner's frontier thesis not only created the field of American Western history, it also changed the way Americans viewed their past and their own character. Turner argued the national character of Americans was shaped by the frontier, and it was unique. Its composite nationality, its democratic institutions, and its egalitarian society. Turner in this presentation charged his fellow historians to examine this frontier process. And the men, who he noted, grew up in these conditions and the political and economic and social results of it. To do this is to study the really American part of our history. Turner went on, the frontier is the line of most rapid and effective Americanization. The wilderness masters the colonist. It finds him a European in dress, industries, tools, modes of travel, and thought. It strips off the garments of civilization and arrays him in the hunting shirt and moccasin. Before long, he has gone to planting Indian corn and plowing with a sharp stick. He shouts the war cry and takes the scalp in orthodox Indian fashion. For 1893 America, Turner's frontier theory encapsulated its national pride. Americans were no longer Europeans. They were an exceptional and a new society and culture. Now, later the New Western history movement would find much to criticize in Turner's thesis. It lacked any consideration of other races and ethnic groups who resided in the American West before the arrival of English settlers. It ignored gender issues. It failed to consider the impact of the unique environmental conditions of various regions in the American West. For example, how did the frontier process differ between the settlement of the Great Plains and the American Southwest, both considered American frontiers? For New Western historians, their ultimate concern with Turner's thesis was its overt, positive view of American expansion and progress. It ignored massacres and forced cultural assimilation of the residents who had resided in the West before this advancement of so-called civilization. However, as these historians examined the regional history of the American West to test Turner's frontier thesis, they neglected to revisit the traditional theory of American settlement that Turner challenged, the germ theory. The germ theory argued America's national character, its culture, its society, and its institutions derived from European sources. Germs brought by American colonists. Immigrants to America simply reestablished these European traits, especially those derived from the ancient Germanic tribes here in the American continent. The German theory argued Americans were rough copies of their European ancestors. In his 1893 address, Turner countered this theory by saying, the outcome of the frontier process is not the old Europe, not simply the development of Germanic germs. The fact is that here is a new product that is American. Thus, the advance of the frontier has meant a steady movement away from the influence of Europe, a steady growth of independence on American lines. Well, today we're going to test both the frontier theory and the germ theory here in Wyoming. Before we do that, I want to step back to the early American frontier and ask you to consider this individual here, William McIntosh. William McIntosh has a strong Scottish ancestry. His parents were fur traders. His father was a fur trader who came over to America. He also has Creek ancestry. In fact, William McIntosh was a respected Creek chief. Now, is this a new American or someone who's simply carrying European germs to the American frontier? How many vote for new American? How many vote for germ-infected European? No? Look at his shirt. I believe the artist, Charles Bird King, left out the McIntosh green on this tartan. If you look at the McIntosh tartan, there are a lot of prominent red stripes in it, but I think for artistic considerations, he left some of the green out of this individual's dress there. I also want to point out that an ancestor of William McIntosh in 1964 arrived in the Highlands during his clan gathering wearing Creek regalia. So, what do we have going on here? It's an interesting dynamic when we look at an individual here. We see obvious elements that Turner pointed out of New American, but we also see some of those European germs still in place here on this individual. Now, by examining the Scottish experience in the American West, can we unravel the threads of past societies and cultures and trace them back to Scotland? Or is this a completely new American cloth? So, we're going to look at that as it plays out here in Wyoming, and I'm going to start with my own family history. As John pointed out, the Johnstons are of Scottish descent. The Borders region, at one time we were infamous cattle thieves and crooks. We didn't do any of that when we got to America, I assure you. So we weren't involved in any of that rustling activity that took place here in Wyoming. My effort to understand this Scottish connection began early in my life. I can remember in grade school, one day, the teacher comes up and says, "What is your cultural heritage?" Well, for me, that was easy. I was born in Wyoming. Both my parents were born in Wyoming. The majority of my grandparents were born in Wyoming. Therefore, my cultural heritage is Wyoming cowboy. Right? All right, the teacher then explained that all Americans are immigrants, and their heritage derived not from America, but mostly from Europe. It's when this happened that I went to my grandmother and said, what group do we belong to over there in Europe? And she said, well, we're Scottish. The Johnston name is Scottish. So I did some follow-up research, and I filled my head with all sorts of visions of these people that lived overseas that have funny accents, wear kilts, drink that alcoholic beverage we refer to as scotch, and then eat some kind of strange meat concoction called haggis. So, but that was a long time ago. That's in the old world, and the Johnston family certainly didn't have much connection to Scotland now. Now, that's what I believed. I believed we were germ-free, or were we? In my current position here at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, I've had the wonderful opportunity to travel to Scotland, meet with Scottish scholars like John and Chris, and I'm coming away with a very different perspective now. Now, I know very little about James Johnston, my great-grandfather, who settled here in the Bighorn Basin, pictured here next to my great-grandmother Glenna. From census records, all I can tell you is he was born on November 6, 1879 in Kansas. His father, whose name I have yet to uncover, was born in Kentucky. His mother, and again I don't know her name, was born in Iowa. By 1910, James moved to Cody, Wyoming, where he met and married my great-grandmother Glenna Spalding, whose family homesteaded on the South Fork of the Shoshone River in 1899. Now, I know he was a Freemason by the presence of the square and compass on his tombstone. His draft registration card noted he was short and stout, a trait that obviously has bypassed this generation. Had brown eyes and dark hair. He listed his occupation as farmer. He had a third-grade education. He identified myself as his employer. My grandfather, Elmo Johnston, was born in 1919 on the South Fork. Now, eventually, James moved into Cody, where he became superintendent of the Cody Canal, and he passed away in 1946, shortly after he witnessed his son Elmo returning back from World War II. Elmo had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, lost a leg, which was removed in a POW camp after he was captured by Germans, returned to Cody to recuperate in a state of very poor health. So where are the germs? I can only trace this generation back to my great-grandfather. Beyond that, it's murky. Now, as a young boy, whenever I retrieved something from my grandfather Elmo, he would simply state, "You're a gentleman, a scholar, and a bird dog." I could really never determine if this was a compliment or if he was teasing me for being so eager to fetch stuff for him. But one day, while I was traveling with Mr. Dixon on one of his marathon all-day trips to the Battle of the Little Bighorn site, with my son Jackson, I mentioned to Jackson after he brought me a cold drink, I said, "Thank you, you're a gentleman, a scholar, and a bird dog." And Chris says, "That's very Scottish." I said, "What's very Scottish?" He said, that saying, "A scholar and a gentleman." That got me thinking, is this a possible germ? So I did some research, and I came across a Robert Burns poem. This poem, and Chris can verify if I'm getting the translation into the Scottish language right here, the Twa Dogs. In this poem, Two Dogs, Burns narrates a conversation between a purebred dog belonging to a lord and a mongrel dog belonging to a plowman. Burns noted in the poem the purebred dog's locked, lettered brass collar showed him the gentleman and scholar. Now, I believe this may be the source of my grandfather's phrase, which I'm sure he probably heard from his father. And on another note, after a trip to Scotland, I discovered why my maternal grandmother was so proud of her grandmother. Now, when my grandmother discusses her grandmother, she just simply says, of course, she was a MacDonald. I never really thought much of that until in Scotland I visited Glencoe, the site of the infamous Glencoe massacre where the Campbell clan killed a few MacDonalds, and to the Battle of Culloden site where a number of MacDonalds fought to restore Bonnie Prince Charlie to the throne of Scotland. So I understand now the pride reflected in my grandmother's voice as she noted her grandmother was indeed a MacDonald. Now, if I can find these germs within my own family, how does the history of this state reflect the influence of Scots in the American West? For this presentation, I'll examine the historical evolution of the Oregon Trail, the route that made Wyoming the gateway to the American frontier for thousands of settlers. The heart of this immigration route is Wyoming's famed South Pass, which allowed settlers an easy passageway over the Continental Divide to either Oregon Territory or California Territory. How did the Scots and their national character impact the development of this important thoroughfare? Wyoming's connections to Scots, which led to the establishment of this trail, began with the American fur trade. In his overview of the Scottish experience in the American West, historian Fernick Morton Shawses described the character of the Scots as follows. Scots' ideas of individual achievement, economic advance, opposition to privilege, and abhorrence of caste happened to be American goals as well. Scots' values of self-restraint, hard work, and education were also the norms towards which many reformers here in the States sought to push the new nation. This common characteristic allowed the Scots to excel in exploration and the fur trade. Shawza continues, Highland and Island Scots dominated the North American fur trade due to their physical endurance. Lowland Scots often, though not always, led the way as explorers of the West. The motivation of these explorers, however, derived less from geography of their homeland than from the geography of the mind. And here we must turn to the Scottish Reformation and the Scottish Enlightenment that established Scotland's goal of a basic education for all males, a far cry from contemporary English distrust of the educated masses. Now, by looking at Shiraz's characteristics of the Scots, we see equality, an inquisitive nature, a democratic nature, and a strong fighting spirit existed before these individuals came to the American frontier. These germs were clearly set before the Scots donned their hunting shirts and set out on the trails to explore and trade. One such Scot is this individual here, Robert Stewart, who was born in Perthshire, Scotland, February 18, 1785, to a teacher and a farmer. In 1807, he immigrated to Canada, where he worked as an agent for the Northwest Company in Montreal. He left the Northwest Company in 1810 to join John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, a venture that wanted to establish a fur trade empire for the United States in the Columbia River Basin. Before he left aboard Astor's ship, the Tonquin, for the mouth of the Columbia River, Robert was engaged to Elizabeth Sullivan. While he was aboard the ship, another group of Astorians, led by Wilson Price Hunt, traveled overland, hoping to travel the Lewis and Clark Trail to the Pacific Northwest, but they moved that just slightly to the south. They traveled overland and arrived at Fort Astoria, which had been established by Stewart and his colleagues. The overland Astorians, unfortunately, were in pretty poor shape. They had lost most of their supplies when they decided to hurry along the travel by rafting that gradual, easy stream known as the Snake River. After losing all their supplies, they decided to continue overland. Shortly after the overland Astorians arrived, the ship the Tonquin was reported destroyed. A group of Indians had attacked, burned this vessel, so the Astorians were basically left with very little supplies. They had no ship to contact the East Coast, so they turned to Robert Stewart. They sent him back east to communicate with John Jacob Astor and send more supplies. Now, Stewart and 6 men set out They followed the Columbian River. Along the way, they also lost many of their supplies. They faced all sorts of problems, such as a blizzard, starvation. They did manage to secure horses, which they quickly lost to a Crow raiding party. When they were talking to a band of Shoshone Indians, hoping to acquire more horses, they learned of this gradual, easy pass that would make it easier for them to cross the Continental Divide in the middle of October. If any of you have been in Wyoming in the middle of October, you know how big of an issue this is. Anyway, Robert Stewart took this advice. He and his men crossed over what is now known as South Pass. These were the first known Europeans to use the pass, but it is interesting to note they were actually traveling from the west to the east. Now, around present-day Casper, they built a structure for themselves, hoping to last through the winter and then continue the trip back east. Again, Indians visited and took all their supplies that they had managed to build up. So they continued down the Platte River. At the Platte River around present-day Torrington, Wyoming, they built another post, waited out the winter, and then finally, on April 30th, 1813, they arrived in St. Louis. If you look at this route, basically, Robert Stewart traveled what becomes the Oregon Trail backwards. So that's why they're called the reverse Astorians. They've traveled this Oregon Trail back to the east. Now, Robert Stewart, when he returns, he was soon ran out of the American Fur Company by another fellow Astorian, Ramsey Crooks. He moved to Detroit, where he speculated in real estate, served as Michigan State Treasurer, and served as Superintendent of Indian Affairs from 1841 to 1845. He passed away on October 29, 1848. Historian Harvey Carter noted that Stewart was known always for his authoritarian ways, and although he doubtless made enemies, he commanded respect, especially among the Indians. Now, as a postscript to this trip, in 1817, a budding American author by the name of Washington Irving paid a visit to Sir Walter Scott at his Abbotsford estate. At that time, Scott was suspected of being the author of the recent anonymously published novel, Waverly. Now, secret Scott tried to keep secret, which I'm sure didn't help, I'm sure it did help book sales. Irving believed that Scott was indeed the author of this book, and he wanted to meet him. So he traveled to Scotland. He traveled the Borders region with Scott's sons and some of Scott's acquaintances and Scott himself. And one must wonder how this influenced Washington Irving later on in his writing. In 1836, Irving published the book Astoria, which told the story of Robert Stewart and the reverse Astorians. Now, meanwhile, back in Wyoming, how am I doing on time? I haven't had a... I know how you keep time, though, Chris. Almost 3. Okay, thank you. Meanwhile, back on the trail, the developing trail in Wyoming, two individuals, William Sublette and a Scot, Robert Campbell, established a new post, Fort William. Fort William was built in 1834 to compete with the American Fur Company, John Jacob Astor's old fur trade company. Campbell grew up in Ulster, Ireland. He's one of these Scots-Irish. At the age of 22, he immigrated to America. In 1825, he joined a group of trappers led by Jedediah Smith and headed to the Rocky Mountains, hoping to improve his health. It's there where he met William Sublette, his future business partner. Now, this post here, Fort Laramie, would eventually become an important supply depot for travelers on the Oregon Trail. It would also become an important military post during the Indian Wars. We'll come back to that here in a little bit. Now, after Sublette and Campbell established Fort William, which later became Fort Laramie, the partnership broke up. They sold out to the American Fur Company and went their separate ways. Now, Robert Campbell, however, did return to Fort Laramie. He returned in 1851 and helped the United States government negotiate the famous Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. He also returned in 1870 to negotiate with Lakota Chief Red Cloud to get his signature on the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Later, Campbell did find his fortune through various business investments in Missouri, and he passed away in St. Louis on October 16, 1879. His contemporaries described him as being kind and fair. Historian Harvey Carter noted Campbell was a Presbyterian in religion and took his Bible reading seriously, as we learn from his journal. Though born in Ireland, he was Scot. There was nothing inevitable about success in the fur trade, and though one cannot question his courage, surely thrift, sound judgment, and persistent application to business were his distinguishing characteristics. Anywhere along the frontier, among Indians or whites, his credit was considerably better than that of the government of the United States. I want to touch briefly upon Sir William Drummond Stewart. Sir William Drummond Stewart is an interesting individual, also from Perthshire, Scotland. He came out west in 1833. He was the second in line to inherit his family estate, and he was frustrated and ran into some personal problems, so he came out here on a lark. He witnessed many of these early events that shaped the Oregon Trail. He met mountain man Jim Bridger. He visited Fort William, Fort Laramie. He also met the first white women to cross the Oregon Trail to use South Pass, Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spaulding. And this was a very significant event for the trail because it indicated to people that women and children could indeed make this difficult journey to the Pacific coast. In 1837, Sir William Drummond Stewart brought with him an artist, Alfred Jacob Miller, who captured some wonderful scenes of the fur trade in the West in what would become Wyoming, including the image of Fort Laramie you saw on the previous slide. This one here, as you can see, is being greeted by a party of trappers. These paintings have since left the estate. They're now scattered all across the country. Many of these Alfred Jacob Miller works of art are also here at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, so you can really get a good sense of what these people were experiencing in the 1830s. While he was here traveling the American West, Stewart learned that his brother passed away, so he went back and inherited Mirthly Castle, as seen here. He decided to give it a little bit more of a Western flavor, so he worked with William Sublette. He ordered some American pine trees, brought in some bison, a few other American Western wildlife, and threw in a couple American Indians just to liven the place up. So here at Mirthly Castle, which we visited on our affinity trip not too long ago, there is a strong presence of the American West. Now in 1860, I want to talk about another Scot who played an important role in the development of the Oregon Trail, Thomas Moonlight. Thomas Moonlight, again another Scot immigrant to Wyoming, found himself as commander of Fort Laramie in the 1860s, which was a very violent time here on the plains. Not only was the conflict, the Civil War going on back east, but due to the lack of military presence here because of the Civil War, hostilities had greatly increased along the western trails. Thomas Moonlight can be credited with organizing the first lynching here in Wyoming. In 1865, two Ogallala men named Two-Face and Blackfoot traveled near Fort Laramie with a white captive and her daughter. After soldiers captured the two men and freed the captives, Moonlight ordered these two Ogallala men to be hanged with logging chains until dead. Again, Wyoming's first recognized lynching. The innocence of these two men remains uncertain. Currently, it is believed the two Lakota were simply returning the woman and her child, who was captured by a band of Cheyenne, but instead of being rewarded, Moonlight's fighting and stubborn nature resulted in their execution. The reason why I bring this up, historian Frederick Luetke cautions us on these cultural tales to be careful. Many of these cultural narratives tend to only praise the great deeds of the ethnic fathers who led their people through the wilderness to establish new homes in a strange land. Analysis of failure, incompetence, mismanagement, intergroup conflict, and stubborn refusal to adapt are less common in this literature. Thomas Moonlight's actions at Fort Laramie remind us of the darker side of the Scottish experience in Wyoming and some of the direct results of that fighting nature. Now, although most of the immigrants on the Oregon Trail settled in other locations, and Wyoming was simply a thoroughfare for them, a few settlers later on did venture to homestead in what is now Wyoming. That includes Clyde and Eleanor Stewart. Eleanor Stewart is an interesting Wyoming figure. She came out to Wyoming to work for Mr. Stewart after she had lost her first husband. We're not sure what happened to him. But her and her young daughter showed up in Colorado to meet Mr. Stewart, go to his homestead in Burnt Fork, Wyoming, which is in the southwest corner of the state, south of the Oregon Trail, and close to the first site of the fur trade rendezvous held in Wyoming in 1825. In 1909, Eleanor and her daughter met her new employer, Clyde Stewart, rode the stage to their new home in Burnt Fork, Wyoming. Eleanor described the meeting as follows in her book, Letters of a Woman Homesteader. Mr. Stewart sat upon a stack of baggage and was dreadfully concerned about something he calls his tookie. But I am unable to tell you what that is. Chris translated it for me, and it means rear end. Describing the stagecoach journey to Wyoming, Eleanor described the road being so muddy and was so full of ruts that the stage acted as if it had the hiccups and made us all talk as though we were affected in the same way. Once Mr. Stewart asked me if I did not think it a gay dour trip. Now, she didn't understand what he was saying. He basically meant to say a rather dour trip, or could be a rather wet trip. Anyway, she replied, I told him he could call it gay if he wanted to, but it didn't seem very hilarious to me. Every time the stage struck a rock or rut, Mr. Stewart would hoot until I began to wish we would come to a hollow tree or a hole in the ground so he could go in with the rest of the owls. When they reached the Stewart homestead, Eleanor noted, at last we arrive, and everything is just lovely for me. I have a very, very comfortable situation, and Mr. Stewart is absolutely no trouble, for as soon as he has had his meal, he retires to his room and plays his bagpipe. Only he calls it his bug peep. The song is The Campbells Are Coming, without variation, at intervals all day long and from 7 until 11 at night. Sometimes I wish the Campbells would make haste and get here. Now, despite her initial reservation regarding her new employer and her attempts to understand Clyde's somewhat annoying Scottish traits, she did later accept his marriage proposal. On her wedding day to Clyde, she reported, I had bought a beautiful pair of shoes to wear on that day, but my vanity had squeezed my feet a little. So while I was so busy at work, I had kept on an old worn pair, intending to put on the new ones later. Mr. Stewart then told me I'd better come over and stand up by him. All I can remember very distinctly is hearing Mr. Stewart saying, I will, and myself chiming in that I would too. Happening to glance down, I saw that I had forgotten to take off my apron and my old shoes. I had dinner to serve right away. I had no time to worry over my odd toilet. Anyway, the shoes were comfortable and the apron white, so I suppose it could have been worse. Now, Clyde and Eleanor did have 2 children between themselves, and one must wonder today if his and Eleanor's descendants are sitting around on their tookies, playing their bug peeps on a gray, dour day, wearing their aprons and their comfortable shoes. And by the way, this is a wonderful book. If anyone has not read this, I strongly urge you to read this. It was made into a film in the late 1970s called Heartland, and Rip Torn was Mr. Stewart. For over 15 years, I taught history at Northwest College. And I taught a class called History of Wyoming. I used University of Wyoming professor Phil Roberts' organizing concepts to structure my course. One of these concepts is diversity in Wyoming, which examines the diverse cultures of those who lived in Wyoming, influenced Wyoming's historical and cultural development. When I introduced this concept to my students, I received a lot of puzzled looks, especially when I stated that Wyoming is a diverse state. When I then asked my students, how many of you are of Scottish descent? A few hands would go up. I would continue. How many of you are Irish descent? A few more hands would go up. I keep going through the list and I'd see hands popping up as I called out French, Spanish, American Indian, Russian, German, Italian, and so on and so on. Hands kept popping up repeatedly. Now, many of the students in my class were Wyoming natives. Their families had been here for generations. I then explained to them, simply put, we are a nation of mutts. We may be gentle, we may be scholarly, but we are a nation of mutts. We originate from many races and ethnic groups. And yes, the frontier and the melting pot created a common American culture, but we still carry among us many germs from our diverse pasts. Scots in the American West offer us an opportunity to examine those hidden germs that Turner inoculated us against in 1893. By further examining these germs, be it Scot or other ethnic groups, we can come to a better understanding of the American West and how diversity influenced its history and culture. In many ways, the American West is a tartan-like mosaic of various races and cultures. The Scots experience in the West, both their great contributions and their failures, offer us an opportunity to tease out some of the threads or germs from this mosaic, providing a better understanding of the historical legacy of the American West, its people, and its impact on the world today. Thank you.